Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Dahl. I'm the Managing Director of Programs and Membership for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. We'll now get our program started. On behalf of UNA-NCA and YPFP, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion of the Biden-Harris administration's approach to foreign policy. First, I would like to thank our partners, the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, and especially their Program Director, Jeff Nam. And on top of all that, most importantly, our panelists, Ambassador Sarah Mendelson and Ted Piccone, for joining us today. UNA-NCA is one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA, with over 1,000 members serving the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. Our mission is to educate and mobilize Americans for a strong US-UN partnership. We do so through our many program committees covering issues such as sustainable development, human rights, international law, and peace and security, as well as a very active group of young professionals and students and a year-round ModUN program engaging middle and high school students in our area and around the world. If you are not yet a member, I strongly encourage you to join UNA-NCA and become a strong voice in our community. There are many opportunities to get involved in our work, and those 25 and under can join free as part of the youth program. As we all know, these are and have been trying times, but UNA-NCA is striving to provide the same high-quality program it always has, just virtually. We've spent the last year and a half in countless Zoom rooms, but we are hopeful to be able to return to in-person programming before the year's end, and we will keep you updated on that. As one upcoming event, I do want to highlight on August 3rd at 6 p.m., we are going to be having a panel discussion organized by our Peace and Security and International Law Committees in partnership with All Souls Church Unitarian of Washington, D.C., entitled Toward a Nuclear Weapons-Free World, Ethics, Social Justice, and Civil Society Activism. Registration is now live on our website for this event, and our website is unanca.org. Again, thank you all very much. We're confident this will be an engaging discussion, and I would like to hand this off to our panel and introduce the moderator of sorts, Ambassador Sarah Mendelson, who will be joined by Mr. Ted Piccone. Please help me in welcoming Ambassador Mendelson and Mr. Piccone. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much and welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And thank you, UNA-NCA and YPFP. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think Ted and I are especially excited to talk about the Biden-Harris administration's approach to foreign policy, particularly because it's certainly a refresh from where we've been in the last couple of years. We're going to begin with some broad strokes from both of us, some major themes that we're seeing. We'll do a bit of a deep dive into multilateralism, and then spend a little time talking about human rights and democracy in a variety of forms, and then have a conversation with you, open it up for questions. So please be thinking about what you might want to follow up on, or what questions we haven't addressed that you're interested in. We'll do our best to answer those. So in terms of broad strokes, major themes, we're seeing very clearly from the president on down a particular focus on democracies delivering at home and abroad, and linking those issues at home and abroad is a new thing. Including social and racial justice, again, at home. And there's a sense of humility with which I think the administration comes to these issues. There's also a big focus on the rise of authoritarianism. China, Russia, vocal about ways in which China and Russia are engaging and interfering with other countries. When they talk about Russia, it's really as a part of a pattern of hybrid warfare. There's a focus on Ukraine, but also Libya, DRC, CAR. We see parastatal actors from Russia in various countries. And of course, there's the issue of interference in elections, as well as attacks on electricity grids and so on. And of course, really strange interference in Belarus and an engagement with neighboring countries that border both the EU and NATO. The Biden administration is also very focused on elevating the fight against corruption. And I see this very much as part of the combating authoritarianism. And particularly, and this is extremely welcome, and frankly, it really emerges from a decade of bipartisan work, so well predating the Biden administration, on making sure that we are not providing an enabling environment for corruption through our financial institutions, real estate firms, et cetera. And that really culminated in the passing of legislation in December on beneficial ownership, making sure that we understand who is actually buying X apartment for $40 million when in fact the person is making $70,000 and can't explain how their wealth is achieved. They're obviously very focused on climate and COVID. They've come into office with huge emergencies and they've responded boldly. Now we're going to spend some more time talking about multilaterals, what we're seeing, what we're not seeing, but I want to hand it over to Ted for the broad strokes that he's seeing.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And nice to see you all. And thanks for joining us. We're right at the 6-month point of the Biden administration taking office. So it's a good time to check in and do a status check. The phrase that President Biden has been using about America's back, let's unpack that a little bit. And I would say overall, it's a fairly encouraging start for the Biden administration when it comes to reviving US leadership on the world stage through both bilateral and multilateral channels amid a tremendous crisis that the world is facing, and very specifically here in the United States. So it's really encouraging. Let's think about what's happening at home. The economy is bouncing back. More and more people are getting vaccinated. It's plateaued. We're seeing a return, but signals are moving in the right direction. So that's a really positive start for the administration. You also have to contrast it to the last 4 years. I mean, that's inevitable. It was a very antagonistic and isolationist, nationalist approach to international cooperation. So under the Trump administration. So there's a lot of damage to repair, and there are unpaid bills to meet, and relationships and promises that need to be tended to and fulfilled. So let me just give some examples that demonstrate what I think is a pretty earnest attempt by the White House to bring America back to the table right from the start. And I think you all know this, but to kind of quickly tick off: rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, John Kerry, a special envoy. You have the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is underway with some meetings coming up later in the year. And President Biden has announced a goal of protecting 30% of the world's land by 2030, 30 by 30. That's a very encouraging sign. Of course, very importantly to the COVID crisis, rejoining the World Health Organization, and also committing up to $4 billion in funding COVID vaccine distribution through the Global Vaccine Access Facility known as COVAX. There's renewed support to the UN Population Fund. There's a return to the UN Human Rights Council. I'll have more to say about that later. There's lifting sanctions on the International Criminal Court. That's maybe a specialist issue in people like us who follow international law, but I think an important step. More in the diagram, the map of personnel, elevating the U.S. ambassador to the UN as cabinet status, and appointing someone who's as well qualified as Linda Thomas Greenfield. Very, very smart move. And Secretary Blinken, of course, is very knowledgeable on these issues. And then a couple of other, renewing the multilateral channels to contain Iran's nuclear capacity. And as difficult as Russia is, at least we have a 5-year extension of the START arms control agreement. So, I think this is all happening at a time when we, generally speaking, US public supports engaging at the UN. And if you think about, and that's true across party lines, even though it is lower levels of approval on the Republican side. And it also includes support for Congress continuing to fund the UN's work. And so when you look over at Congress, Congress during the Trump years mostly rejected all of those budget cuts that the Trump administration pushed. And I think that's important to recognize, even though there's a lot of heated rhetoric. At the end of the day, the dollars keep flowing. However, there are significant arrears due to ongoing disputes over how to calculate peacekeeping costs. So, you know, so far this year, the Biden administration has put in its budget a significant down payment to close that gap of $300 million. And congressional appropriators are on board so far. It still has to go through several steps. But Congress, for now, is in Democratic hands. So hopefully we'll see some further increases in funding to international agencies and fewer conditions attached to it. Let me stop there.
So just to continue a little bit on the multilateral front, everything that you've noted is in some ways related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I should say that, you know, the multilateral front is not just obviously the UN. They were just at the G7, G20, at least on the financial side. We just had the HLPF, which I'll return to in a second. UNGA's coming up. There'll be the COP. There's the 10th anniversary of the Open Government Partnership. Next year, the World Justice Project will host the World Justice Forum, and we hope that there will be senior level administration officials focused on closing the justice gap. So it is actually somewhat puzzling to me, and here I want to, in some ways, push a little bit in terms of new approaches that we want to see from the Biden-Harris administration. It's puzzling that so many of the policies that the Biden-Harris administration have rolled out dovetail so well with the Sustainable Development Goals, and yet they haven't talked that much about the SDGs or how they address development happening everywhere, development happening in the United States as well as the Global South. And of course, the SDGs are about climate, but they're also about the climate of communities and creating peaceful, just, and inclusive communities. And I think a few of us who watch the SDGs closely and watch the high-level political forum, which just happened in New York, where countries come together to report out their progress on the SDGs, there was no talk about a voluntary national review, which is how countries talk about their progress on the SDGs. And this is important because the Obama Biden administration helped shape the SDGs, of course, along with millions of people around the world. But this is an agenda that is really built for this time. So I think we're still hopeful that we'll see some progress on this. There's a lot of work happening around the United States on the SDGs. There are cities and universities, Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, where I work, LA, a number of universities in LA, Orlando, Minneapolis, New York City, the state of Hawaii. So there's actually a domestic constituency for development that understands sustainable development. And I think it's one that can help us in our international development work. We're always looking for domestic constituents who can make the argument to Congress why this is important and relate what's going on domestically, but also it will lend itself, I think, to a more diverse implementing partner community that works internationally and also opens the door for peer-to-peer work. Let me just spend one more moment on people as policy. We're seeing an enormously talented team take office, both at the State Department, at AID, obviously in the White House, US UN. We're still a little bit slow on ambassadors being named, and ultimately, really to advance diplomacy and development, we need ambassadors out there. This isn't all the administration's fault. It's slow in Congress to confirm folks. We did have a slew of folks who had hearings at the assistant secretary level today, and so that's extremely welcome. But generally, I think most folks tracking these issues find fewer confirmations in the Biden administration than in the Obama administration, although well more than in the Trump administration. But that, we don't have a lot of time. I mean, we're literally finished the first quarter of the first half of the first quarter. And while we used to say you can get a lot done even in the last quarter, the time really flies, and you get to a point where you don't have much runway. it's really difficult to make things happen. So I think that the push over the next 6 months is to really try and make as many of those slots named, confirmed. But it's also the case, interestingly, that some of the slowness is because the administration is really focused on making sure that candidates are diverse. And that this is really an important point, particularly for young people. There is a need for the State Department to be, and for AID, to be much more representative of the US population in general, including young people, including a focus on tech. But I would also argue there is a role, I think, in the 21st century for subnational diplomacy. I think that there's cities are playing more and more of a role. Houston, for example, has a budget, if you will, that as does LA, that rivals a lot of countries. Certainly the state of California does. And there's a lot of peer-to-peer, mayor-to-mayor conversations going on. There's legislation that's being proposed to create at state a subnational office of diplomacy. And I think that that would help, and I think it should be the case in multilateral spaces at the UN. More and more we are seeing cities represented. I think that's a healthy step. And it creates more space, in fact, for young people and for diverse issues. But let's do a little bit of a deep dive on the HRC, Ted. What's your thinking about this?
Sure. I've been tracking the UN Human Rights Council and the system for human rights at the UN for several years. And maybe it's worth pausing and looking at where it stands, because the administration has been really flagging this connection that Sarah talked about of doing better at home, doing better abroad, how these relate to each other, and also, of course, a foreign policy for the middle class, and making sense of all these international agreements and discussions for the average person. And of course, UNA plays such an important role in doing that around the United States. So, the Human Rights Council, the principal human rights body at the UN based in Geneva, has become increasingly politicized here in the United States. And it's become a bit of a political football between the administrations, Republican and Democrat. So you had the Bush administration at the time the council was created, they withdrew, Obama returned with a lot of energy and effort. And then Trump, after some mild attempts to engage, left in a huff. And now Biden has promised to come back and will run for a seat on the Human Rights Council this fall, but is otherwise re-engaging. The problem is there are several issues. One of them is membership on the council is made up of a mix of states, as the world is a very complicated place. And there are, of course, authoritarian regimes that abuse human rights and should not be sitting on the council, but are elected by the UN General Assembly. The council also has an inherent bias against Israel in the sense that it has a standing item that's just on Israel. It's the only country that's treated that way, and that needs to change. And that's become a real political problem here in the United States. So the question is not whether these problems are real, they are, but how best to address them. And I think, my argument is if you withdraw from the council and kind of pretends it goes away, it's just not the right approach. We know from the historical record that, in fact, when the US withdraws, there is more scrutiny and criticism of Israel. And that maybe needs to be thought through more carefully. We also know that when the Obama administration fought to get on the council, it built a lot of cross-regional coalitions of the non-authoritarian states. There are a variety of types of regimes, and some of them are quite willing to partner with us if we show leadership on voting for resolutions where the council is actually dispatching experts and setting up commissions of inquiry and making statements that really make it clear what the universal human rights concept is and what it means in real terms. We've seen new mandates on Iran, on sexual orientation and gender identity, and I can go through a long list. So under Obama administration, I think the Human Rights Council showed that it could be an effective body. And as I said, when the US walked away under Trump, what happens? China and its allies filled the void very quickly. And you see a very clear pattern where China is really on offense. It used to be on defense. It used to sit on the council or in the previous body and be a bit passive, except when it came to its own issues. Now, not only is it defending its own record, it's attacking many other countries, especially the United States, Canada, Australia, and of course, deflecting any attention on its own problems. But more importantly, it's introducing resolutions that try to undermine the whole idea of an activist human rights council, in which there's such a thing as a universal concept for human rights, and we have an independent body that looks at the facts on the ground. And I'm very concerned by the number of attempts, and many successful, that China has led to try to weaken the overall instrument of that the council represents. And of course, why? China is an economic power, and it has the weight and that it didn't used to have, and now has, to get a lot of its friends and allies on board. They can use their trade and investment and debt relations to influence states to defend their own record and defend each other on grounds, of course, of national sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs, which most states are, all for that. But even recently, they're using vaccine diplomacy as a way to get countries to quiet down their criticism of the treatment of Uyghurs in the country. This just happened recently with Ukraine, where they had promised to send a certain number of vaccines. Ukraine was on the list to sign a statement that was critical of China. The Chinese intervened, and Ukraine's name didn't make it to the list, and they got their vaccines. So this is what we're hearing more and more of, and I'm very concerned. So the China story, this is just one element of a much bigger China story, right? But it is something that's a little more systemic when it comes to the role of this particular body in the UN system, and it's happening in many other places. So the United States is saying, we're going to be back, we're going to challenge China, and to do that effectively, they need to be willing to actively participate and receive the scrutiny of the Human Rights Council. So in the past year, after the George Floyd murder, the council started issuing statements and resolutions, and just recently, Secretary Blinken agreed to receive one of the independent experts on racism in the United States, to visit here and look at our record and provide us recommendations. So that's quite encouraging, and I'll pause there.
So I want to pick up on this issue of universality because I'm thinking about it a lot. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to us all, but there's a lot of contestation about whether or not universality should really apply in this country. I mean, when you think back about whether or not we could have gotten the Universal Declaration of Human Rights then or now through Senate, when Eleanor Roosevelt introduced the Declaration, she realized that the number of segregationist senators would make it impossible. So universality is as relevant today as it was, I would say, in 1948. And this brings me to this issue around the Sustainable Development Goals and new approaches to democracy and combating authoritarianism. I agree completely that when the US is not at the table, others fill the seats. And it was something that we thought a lot about when I was in the US mission at the UN. And I encountered many ways in which the Chinese government was trying to close space, and other governments, around civil society and trying to keep folks blocked. And one of the ways in which the Chinese are successful is they run for positions and then they win them within the UN system. So it's something that the Biden administration doesn't grab headlines, but it's something that the Biden administration, certainly at the State Department, needs to be thinking about. And luckily, we have as a nominee Michelle Sisson, who is the deputy perm rep at USUN and who knows full well how the system works. But it's extremely important that we also refresh how we think about and do work around the world with allies on advancing, supporting democracies and helping democracies deliver. That is really a key piece of the Biden administration's foreign policy, but I want to understand that as the full spectrum of rights. So socioeconomic issues need to be much more elevated than they were, for example, during the Cold War, when we really focused on a set of rights that had to do with around rights of the person, detention, torture. We need, particularly in a post-pandemic world, to understand democracy promotion to be much more related to the full variety of sustainable development goals. Now, happily, this is an agenda that every ally that we have has signed on to. We're the only OECD country, the only G20, that has not done a voluntary national review. And we hope to see that change. Just over 40 countries the other day signed on to something called the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, which is about aligning recovery from the pandemic with the SDGs. And I want to tip my hat to colleagues at the Danish Human Rights Institute who were so instrumental in working this in Geneva. But the agenda associated with SDG 16 in particular is profoundly relevant to democracies and would, for example, prioritize closing gaps around access to justice, as well as elevate transparency and accountability. So the question is, as the Biden administration builds out the Summit for Democracy, and I've spent the last 6 months working with colleagues from around the country, but also at Freedom House CSIS and the McCain Institute, to think about what this Summit for Democracy ought to look like. And the first basket is that it should really be about the domestic reform agenda. And we should be having consultations in the US around the country for what that looks like, but encouraging our allies to do the same. And then coming to the table and sharing, this is what we're doing, what are you doing? There are all sorts of other baskets that need to be addressed, but I think really having that through plot of development happening everywhere and the domestic reform agenda being critical. Back to Congress for a moment. There are lots of geopolitical reasons why we need to do democracy promotion differently, and the Summit for Democracy offers that possibility. But I want to note a report that came out of CSIS, my former employer, by a former colleague, Mike Casella, who was the budget guru at USAID. It's called Earmarks and Directives in the Foreign Operations Appropriations. So this is very inside Washington conversation. But to be blunt, the appropriations process has driven the supply of funds to whom and for what. And I'm suggesting the potential pivot from the current supply side modality to a much more demand-driven work in which disaggregated data, understanding how different populations are experiencing needs would be really elevated, and understanding how we work with those communities to respond to those needs. And I think it would actually address some of the issues around closing space and the accusations of foreign interference that civil society has experienced. But let me throw it back to Ted before we open it up to Q&A. So be thinking about your questions, please.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue to a couple points I wanted to make about President Biden's goal to create a Summit for Democracy later this year, maybe early 2022. We're waiting anxiously to hear the details. They've laid out an agenda which, Sarah mentioned earlier, the corruption agenda is very high on the list for this administration, appropriately. Also, the rise of authoritarianism as an important concept, and that has to be pushed back. And of course, protecting human rights and the role of civil society around the world. So the main point to make here is the United States has to practice what it preaches. It can no longer just stand up there and say, you should do this, this, and this. We've gone through a massive decline in democracy in this country and the rule of law. And January 6th epitomized the low point there. So we have some work to do at home just to restore our credibility as a democracy example in the world, let alone promoter. So that's step one. The summit needs to be organized in a way that we do homework here and we bring that to the table at the summit and show by example that we're resilient, we learn through our mistakes and we improve, and there's a constant process of self-correction. Democracies are imperfect. Every system is imperfect, but it sure beats, in my view, a closed authoritarian system that you see in China and elsewhere. So the White House needs to engage new domestic voices in the United States on this agenda. Of course, internationally as well. It needs to be done before, during, and after the summit. And then, of course, in thinking about who should be at the table besides civil society in terms of the states, my view is they should be cautious on who to invite and require commitments from them before they show up. Then finally, don't create a whole lot of new multilateral mechanisms. As Sarah pointed out, we already have the SDGs and the voluntary national reviews. How about complying with it? We have national action plans with the Open Government Partnership. Make sure those are done. We have the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council. Do our part there. There are plenty of multilateral mechanisms for the follow-up work that has to be done. And of course, we would offer our World Justice Forum, as Sarah pointed out, next May, June, as a forum to bring some of those results to the table. Thanks. So questions?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Nam, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs at YPFP. I will be assisting Ambassador Mendelson and Ted with questions you may have during our Q&A session. So please start typing away any questions you might have in the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll be reading those out shortly to our speakers as they come in. So we've already had a few questions come in, so let me start with the first one. Are there any spillovers of Biden's policies on Russia and China that protects religious freedoms for locals in both countries?
I'm not sure what the spillover means. I think that the protection of civil society organizations, faith-based communities, human rights defenders, all of this is incredibly important. I think Secretary Blinken has been pretty clear how he sees the prosecution of the Uyghurs in China. But I do think there's some new thinking that needs to go on in terms of something that Freedom House has found, which is that governments, China, Russia, we saw with Iran recently in the United States, the reach of countries to be able to find critics and hurt them, journalists, human rights defenders. We need to be thinking about joint work around exile and supporting people who are forced into exile and what that looks like. Because more and more, the ability to support people in various countries is constrained, and yet it continues to be important to us. So we need some 21st century approaches to this, recognizing that a lot of countries, including Russia and China, talk about sovereignty, and they're in some ways advancing a hyper sovereign approach. And certainly when they don't want to talk about universality of human rights, they don't want it to be happening inside their country. And yet through technology, they're so able to enter other countries' space. But it's even more than through technology. I mean, we've seen people murdered in the UK and Germany by Russian operatives. So we need to really do much more in a joint way. And I think this is part of the logic behind the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy is it's not just declarations of reform at home, it's how do we do this work jointly that actually meets the moment?
Yeah, I would just add on the Uyghur case in particular in China, the administration has been very strong in calling it out. They're very, I think at this point we can say, well-documented evidence of, at a minimum, cultural genocide. And at the heart of that is a willingness on our part to, and I would have to say, you know, we're Europeans and others stepping up to impose some sanctions on China for their treatment of the Uyghurs there. And that's a religious freedom question as well as a cultural and linguistic and historical minority protection issue. And shockingly, you know, the Organization of Islamic Conference States have not been that vocal in defending the Uyghur minority rights here. And it does kind of scratch your head a little bit. Now, to what extent is that China talking to them privately and saying, look, don't, and we'll take care of you in some other ways, or, you know, whether it's carrots or sticks. It is unusual that a body that stands up for Islamic values and solidarity is not out there speaking on behalf of the Uyghur Muslims. And it's not just there in Xinjiang, it's in other places too. So that would be my comment on that question.
Thank you both for your responses. So to the next question, one of the members noticed that a lot of the discussion focused on international development. The FY 2022 also discusses a lot of increases in humanitarian assistance funds. Do either of you have any comments in regards to that under the Biden administration?
So I want to pick up something that was extremely important at USUN when I served. It was the theme of a summit in May 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit. There is a paradigm shift that needs to happen, that was beginning to happen, that is also related to the SDGs, and that is the demand-driven response, a focus on data and understanding what local communities need. Sometimes it's called localization. The World Bank issued a similar statement to what OCHA did at the time. OCHA's paper was something along the lines of shared responsibility. The World Bank's version was called the Grand Bargain. And the point was to elevate the funding that was going to local organizations and making sure local voice was much more elevated. And to me, the really most profound example was what we saw in southern Turkey, where families were fleeing from Syria. And my colleagues at OFTA, the Foreign Disaster Assistance Office, would show up, and we had WASH, we had expertise on water, sanitation, et cetera. But these families wanted education for their children, but we didn't necessarily have education experts or educating children that are emerging from conflict. And so you saw mass migration onto Europe. So I think you're going to see in the Biden administration an elevated focus, particularly in both longer term development, but humanitarian, trying to shrink that handshake between humanitarian assistance to development and really elevating the focus on local needs, data driven, and figuring out how we do that better and make sure that it's more demand driven rather than supply side driven.
Okay, so the next question by this audience member is, what do you think are the most effective ways for the general public, especially young people such as YPFP or UNA-NCA members, who are already engaged in this work to push the Biden-Harris administration to comply with the SDGs, as well as implement them in our own communities?
Sounds like a question I planted, but I didn't. You know, there's a bill in Congress, Representative Barbara Lee, who I was honored to meet when she came to USUN, and she was looking for help in figuring out how to navigate something very difficult, the NGO community, which might as well be called the anti-NGO committee. It's how you get accredited to be able to engage at the UN. And it takes a very long time, and a lot of countries are very hostile to organizations that do anything related to human rights. She was representing the Black Congressional Institute. And we had a long talk about the SDGs, and she was very excited. She thought this was particularly interesting to communities of color in the United States and would really help with the struggle for racial justice in this country. She has a bill in Congress to support the SDGs. So to the extent that young people can, through UNA, let members of Congress know that this is important to young people. I think anytime youth organizations are engaging the Biden administration, that they raise the entire frame of the SDGs. Yes, it's climate, but it's also a huge agenda around combating poverty and, of course, creating these peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. We're also hoping, and watch the space at Carnegie Mellon, that there'll be some effort at creating some policy toolkits that busy young people can use to engage policymakers, whether in Congress or in the executive branch.
Thank you for that response. So to the next question, can you speak on the reforms that need to be undertaken by the United Nations and the multilateral system to become more relevant in a post-COVID-19 era?
Well, I'm sure Sarah has a long list of ideas there. I mean, most of the focus on reform has been on management reform, budgetary reform, and in fact, a number of those steps have already been taken. Lots of budget cutting took place over the last several years, and it's had an impact in terms of service delivery and what the UN system can do. I think with the US coming back on the budget side, some of that will be restored, and that's really and with greater transparency and oversight, and all that's really good. One thing that's happened this year very quietly is the re-election of Antonio Guterres as Secretary General for a second term, and the process was too quiet. I mean, there was no competition, really. There was no serious competition. There's very little debate, very different from 5 years ago when there was a big push for greater competition, transparency, women as candidates. So I think that process is not what it could be. It's a very important position. And then you think about his leadership role. He of course was dealt a very weak hand as Secretary General. Not only the Trump administration's attitude, but the role of China and Russia as P5 members in blocking so many important issues, including on Syria, for example, but other efforts to raise human rights issues. North Korea is an example, and Ambassador Haley tried very hard, and I think made some incremental steps forward on that. But this is a pretty tough crowd for Guterres to manage, and I think sometimes the critique is that he needs to use a little bit more of the bully pulpit and a little more force, rhetorical and otherwise. I don't mean otherwise in terms of physical force, but that I think that could be, and I think he has a window of opportunity here with the Biden administration, that he could really step up and play that role. And I think that would be pretty welcomed certainly by this White House.
I have to second what Ted said about the Secretary General. Having witnessed and been involved in the process, the last time I had the honor of representing the U.S. questioning, in particular, Helen Clark, who was standing for that job. This was a very strange outcome and process, and it wasn't really what we expected. It's almost as if no one wanted the job, which is very disturbing. I mean, I think we need to sort of step back and think about what we just saw and why that happened. And I've been in so many conversations about the need for reform around the Security Council. And I know that there is great reluctance oftentimes in the executive branch to engage in that conversation. But this administration seems so willing to talk about so many taboo topics that they've inherited over time. And I think thinking through the fact that the Security Council is so dysfunctional is really important. I don't have an answer of what to do. I have seen and participated when the General Assembly grew so frustrated with the Security Council not being able to address issues, for example, in Syria. You had really amazing diplomats, and I'm thinking of Marc-André Blanchard and Christian Vinevasser from Liechtenstein, who just said, we're not going to stand for this anymore. So I think that, ways in which the General Assembly takes up the mantle when the Security Council repeatedly, with tremendous amount of data and evidence, turns away or does nothing in the face of absolutely gross human rights abuse, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And so yeah, and I would say one last thing, which is outside the UN, it's in the UN system, but it is actually in our control, and that is an enhanced use of the Universal Periodic Review by various countries. I was particularly focused on trying to get a special investigation on North Korea more publicly available when I was at US UN. It was incredibly difficult to do for reasons I still don't entirely understand. But there's a really amazing review of North Korea. And there are all sorts of countries that weighed in on the Universal Periodic Review for North Korea, Malaysia, Bangladesh, asking really important questions. And if there's a way in advocacy to sort of work with local organizations to pick up and elevate the UPR, I think that's a mechanism we've all agreed to, and there's more that can be done with that.
And just to illustrate and support Sarah's point, the most recent case of the UN General Assembly getting fed up with the Security Council and taking action was on Myanmar. Really striking example. And the number of states that chose to abstain at least and not oppose a very hard-hitting resolution. It's at least a step in the right direction.
Oh yes, we would abstain if you can just not be in the room, please.
Like we did, well, Cuba, of course, the annual vote condemning the U.S. embargo on Cuba just took place, and unfortunately, the U.S. returned to its position of voting against it, whereas Obama actually abstained in that vote. Yeah.
Thank you both. I think both of those are very, very helpful tips or possible areas of improvement for the UN. So
just for the record, I'm actually of mixed opinions on whether we should have abstained, but for the Cuba vote, but that's another conversation.
Fair enough. So next question is actually kind of related to your responses. So what would either of you suggest that the US do to address the UN Human Rights Council's bias against Israel? Would it be prudent to introduce new resolutions condemning actions by other human rights abusing countries like China, rather than try to eliminate resolutions currently against Israel?
My proposal would be to build a consensus on the council to change the way Israel's treated at the council, not remove Israel from the council agenda. I think we can all accept some realities on the ground in Israel regarding the human rights situation there and the situation of Palestinians in particular. But, instead of having 7 resolutions, you have 1 resolution and you don't have a dedicated item on the agenda. It's treated like every other country where it's kind of a technical list of items and categories of items. So there are other country resolutions, whether it's Myanmar or North Korea or Burundi. Israel should be in that list. And that would be a relatively simple way to handle it. Then the question would be, well, there are some Arab states, of course, that like all the scrutiny that Israel gets and criticism. How do you bring them on board? Is there something that you could do to give Palestine a voice more than it currently has? And of course, that would be a contentious issue, but one that is probably worth trying to tackle.
I mean, having served in New York, the anti-Israel bias, for somebody who isn't tracking the UN on a day-to-day basis, it's hard for me to exaggerate how often and I would encounter it. It is intense, it's widespread, and as an American Jew, it begins to blend in weirdly with other kinds of things. And you know, there's a conversation still about the Holocaust within the UN, and you know, we had very moving ceremonies where we would recognize the Holocaust. We'd recognize other kinds of atrocities like the Holodomor in Ukraine, the famine. But you know, my gut impression was I almost wanted to have a point-by-point conversation with various diplomats who are bringing these issues up. Like, you know, let's unpack what's going on here. I mean, I agree with Ted. Of course, we need to understand and treat Israel like other countries, particularly in the HRC, around human rights abuses. No question about it. But the degree to which this happens in New York, well outside and in sort of almost not random ways, because it's not random, it's very intense. And you know, we weren't alone in observing this. The Canadians and the Australians and the Brits in particular were very mindful of it. But it is it's, and Israel's not the only country to experience this, but they get it more than any other single country. And so understanding it's a part of something else that's going on, and understanding that, I think, is important.
Well, thank you both for your responses to all the questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all the questions, but I do appreciate the ones that were submitted and responded to by both of our speakers. So Ambassador Mendelson, Ted, I want to thank you both for joining us on what's been a very lively and engaging discussion. I know I took a lot away from these conversations myself, and I know our audience members did as well. Do either of you have any closing remarks you'd like to share with our audience members?
Just to particularly the young people who are listening, I think, you know, I am a product of the Cold War, right? I began life as a Sovietologist, and I'm a Russia specialist. And the divide between things international and things domestic was sort of ironclad. And I think that that's just not the way it is in the 21st century. I think that as young people, you need to develop expertise, yes, on foreign policy, but there are also issues domestic politics that have a bearing on foreign policy, and understanding that fluidity, I think, is really important. And that's another reason why I think the Sustainable Development Goals are particularly interesting and relevant for right now, but also for what I think of as cohort 2030, or the generation that has the most to gain or lose by how much we are able to advance by 2030. Think how old you will be in 2030. Think about the following 15 years when the world community adopts the follow-on to the SDGs, and there's more work to be done there. So thank you so much for your engagement. Ted, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I like that hopeful message. I think I'm going to add on this bit of a sour note, and it's in response to some of the questions that I missed earlier. The role of China. You know, I think we do have a very serious competition brewing that's about two very different systems of governance. And when you hear the Chinese talking about human rights with Chinese characteristics, you know, it's a direct attack on the whole concept of universal human rights. And I think you can take that principle down the road, down the line. And it's a real threat to our current system of international cooperation and international law. So I think it's really important for folks on this call to think hard about China. I've been doing some writing on China's role in Latin America, and you see the power that it exerts there. And when the US is missing and they get a better deal from China, it's understandable that a number of states would choose China as a partner, but that comes with costs and conditions. And to be, you know, it's not a very transparent relationship. There's a lot of things we don't know that's going on because the Chinese system is not transparent. And that would be my greatest concern going forward in terms of an overarching kind of meta threat to the UN and multilateralism, and one that we need to keep working on. Thanks.
Thank you both again. I'd also want to thank Andrew and the United Nations Association National Capital Area for partnering with us on this very special event today. We hope to do more events like this with you in the future. I also want to thank the YPFP and UNA-NCA members, as well as guests in attendance, for spending time with us today. YPFP works to build the foreign policy leaders of tomorrow by providing members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing and publication. If you're not a YPFP member yet today, we encourage you to become a member today. Andrew, please feel free to also toss in your organization's sign-up link in the chat as well. And once again, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in future events.